Welcome to Tech Tribe, NetCetera's podcast. In this episode, Accessibility Lost in the Clipboard, I'm excited to share my host seat, or even better, hand it to my colleague, Vesela Mihaylova Vladimirova. So she's a UX designer in digital banking and part of NetCetera's culture team.
Thank you, Ivana. It's nice to be here. It's nice.
Our two guests today are Aleksandar Cindrikj, a senior UX designer with over 10 years of experience, who's passionate about making digital spaces accessible for everyone, and Adrian Heydecker, who's been shaping user experiences for 2 decades, currently focused on accessibility in retail banking.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
The discussion is how thoughtful design can make digital experiences truly inclusive. Let's get started.
Yes, it's now my turn to set up the stage. By setting up the stage, let's start with the very kind of straightforward question about the definitions. So, what is digital accessibility? And is it only for the blind people?
This question is such a great starting point because it allows us to clarify some big misconceptions around digital accessibility. So first off, digital accessibility isn't just about making things accessible for people who are blind. That's a common misunderstanding. Digital accessibility refers to the practice of designing and developing digital services and products such as web or mobile applications so that individuals can use them meaningfully and effectively regardless of any disabilities they may have. Disabilities can be categorized into 3 types: permanent disability, temporary, and situational disability. When people talk about disabilities, they often focus on individuals with permanent impairments, like those with low vision or blindness. Unfortunately, many other disabilities, such as hearing or speech impairments, mobility impairments, difficulties with fine motor skills, but also non-visible disabilities like dyslexia and autism are forgotten. Everyone will experience some form of disability at some point in their lives, which is why we must also consider the temporary and situational disabilities. Temporary disabilities happen when someone temporarily loses the ability to perform certain tasks due to illness or some medical conditions. For instance, a person with a cast on their arm may not be able to use a mouse or a keyboard. Situational disabilities arise when specific circumstances limit someone's ability to perform some tasks. A common example is a parent holding a baby, which prevents them from using both hands, similar to the example that I mentioned for temporary disabilities. Or as another example is someone using an ATM or smartphone in bright sunlight where it's difficult to see the content on the screen. So in conclusion, digital accessibility doesn't just benefit individuals with visual impairments, but also impacts a wide range of visible and non-visible disabilities across all 3 categories that I mentioned.
Aleksandar, thank you. This was a very, very good and very deep explanation about the theory. I don't know if Adrian also has to add something.
I wouldn't add something because I think Aleksandar showed how broad this topic is and that it basically also it affects all of us. So it's not just for somebody else. I mean, I'm wearing glasses, so I'm having a disability, to be honest. And as the baby example showed, I mean, this is stuff that happens just in your daily life, that you might not be able to hold the device in your hand, how it's supposed to be and stuff like that. So I think it's important to see that it's a wide spectrum and it can affect all of us. And we have to design for that.
I like that you emphasize on this point because it's also something which I learned lately, like learning and more about the topic. Let me ask you. So, if I am about to approach this topic in my team and on my project, what are the low-hanging fruits or the first steps that one can take to ensure that services are available for people with disabilities? Alex, do you want to start?
Yeah, of course. So before developing digital solutions, it's crucial to identify our users, understand their needs, and determine which tools they use to access the product. Disability is a mismatch between the user needs and the design of a digital product. The first thing we need to understand about making our services accessible is that it's not just one person's job. In fact, everyone involved in the software development process has a role to play in creating accessibility. I would mention product owners who are responsible for making accessibility a priority and allocating the necessary resources to keep it at the forefront for the team. UX professional definitely play a key role by incorporating diverse user groups during the research, design, and testing phase. UI developers and front-end developers are responsible for implementing accessible solutions by following guidelines like VCAC. And lastly, it's important to mention that QA engineers verify the product's compliance with accessibility standards through testing and validation.
Maybe if I can add a little bit to that, I think in the project world there are requirements. I mean, you have an app that needs to do this and needs to do that, and often we focus on those functional requirements. But I think it's very important to also state the non-functional requirement that accessibility needs to be provided to a certain level. So first we have to agree on it that it needs to be done, because otherwise it doesn't just like fall from the trees in some magic way. We need also to define, because as we've seen in the intro question, the spectrum is pretty wide. So what do we want to address? How far do we go? Where do we stop? And also, I think what's a very good measure that you also mentioned, Alexander, is that we have to test it. I mean, you can always put it in some requirements document and then forget about it. But when you start testing it, when you start changing the font sizes on mobile app, when you start using the voiceover in your web browser, when you maybe invite someone with a disability to use the first version of your app, then it becomes pretty much visible. And it's also a motivation then for the developers and everybody involved to improve on it. And I mean, there are some low-hanging fruits, because you asked about that as well, especially in web developments. There are a lot of good frameworks around it as a starting point. So you can use good web frameworks that also have a built-in level of accessibility support to get you off the ground, so that you don't have to do all the heavy lifting yourself.
Great. If I may summarize, the 3 points is define, or 4 points actually. Define your users, involve everyone, right? All the stakeholders, involve them, align them with making requirements and making the checklist, and then test. Did I summarize this correctly?
Yes. And use good tools.
Great. I think this is very, very practical knowledge that not only me, but all our listeners can use. And going to the next questions, what, according to your experience, we are talking about the banking business, because this is where we are all experts, and that's kind of where the most experience we have. So what are the problems and examples that people with disabilities face when using banking services?
I have two good examples for you here from a person that's 90.5 or something % blind and is using digital banking services. And we had the pleasure to work with him. And he pointed out that actually his most the biggest obstacle that he's running into nowadays is paying, because we have a lot of digital payment and credit cards. Here in Switzerland, there are a lot of credit card terminals that are now being replaced, and they are replaced by terminals with a touchscreen. So they used to have physical buttons, like to enter your PIN, and now they are replaced with devices that have a touchscreen. And this person, he cannot simply operate that device anymore. So when he's a restaurant, he wants to pay. Basically, he has to reveal his PIN number to the waiter to be able to pay. That's the only way. I mean, besides cash, that he can choose now. And we also asked him about banking, more like in that sense. What's the problem for him there? And he was like, yeah, the hardest part is actually finding a good bank for you that has a good accessibility aware, let's say, a banking software. Because you only know that once you have signed up for the bank, done all the paperwork, opened an account, transferred your first amount of money into that account until you can really experience it. So there's not much information out there in the world for people with like severe disabilities. There's no like accessibility ranking or so that they can use to figure out which banks provide a good service for them.
I see. Wow, that's the example you gave of the person who has to share their PIN with the waiter. That's like a big invasion in your private space, right? And it's a big security issue that it's. I find like a really, really extreme, but it's the reality, right, that these people have to face.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an example of a challenge that people with disabilities are facing or are going through. But I am curious about your experience and your challenges. Like, what is the biggest challenge, or what are the biggest challenges of a user experience designer who starts and who works actively on accessibility?
Yes, so I think my biggest challenge so far has been convincing key stakeholders to invest into accessibility. So that's always something. I mean, of course, this costs time and money, and we have to factor it in. It also slows down development, if you will, like that. And I mean, that's why it's not so popular if I approach my product management and tell him, hey, how about spending this amount of time and money into making our app more accessible and slow down our development by X weeks? I mean, that's a pill that's hard to swallow if you approach your product manager like that. And so maybe we're coming back to that initial statement that we basically have to get all the stakeholders on board and that we have to define it as a requirement. I mean, this is basically the first step. So you have to have a buy-in from like key stakeholders that they actually see this as a feature and they want to do it.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm curious what Aleksandar, what are the challenges, if they are the same or maybe different? Let's see what.
I would definitely mention the UI design perspective. So finding the right balance between visually appealing designs and accessible functionality can be definitely challenging. Certain animation design elements or functionalities such as drag and drop may create barriers for users with disabilities. Therefore, we must carefully make adjustments and provide alternatives that preserve both aesthetics and accessibility. Testing for a wide range of disabilities, for example, cognitive, visual, motor, and many more, requires different tools and approaches. Ensuring a product works seamlessly for all users can become complex as the needs for each group vary significantly. So those two things are definitely the most challenging, in my opinion, from UA perspective, let's say.
I hear the designer in you sometimes a bit crying, if I can say that, but it's for a good cause, right? Like once you have accessibility in mind, okay, you might have to do some compromises sometimes, but it actually improves the quality of the service in total. So I think it's possible to deliver something which is visually appealing and also accessible, right?
Yeah.
Good. Let's say we have all the prerequisites. So we have all the stakeholders. They are in. We got the time to work on this. And then how do we approach this on our project? How do we start? And how do we work on that? Would you share, Alex? Maybe you can start.
Yes. I'm currently working on one of our products, the 3D Secure Issuer Service, which is a key component of the payment process and is used by a large number of users worldwide. As a very first step, we began with a testing phase to assess the accessibility level of our product, also known as accessibility audit. We implemented automated tests using tools and libraries like X and conducted manual checks with tools and add-ons such as Wave, as well as assistive technologies like screen readers. In addition to these tests, it's crucial to involve users with disabilities and gather their feedback on accessibility features and any barriers they face when accessing the service. No tool can provide insights as valuable as those from actual users. After reviewing the audit results, we created a strategy, prioritized the issues, and proceeded with implementing solutions following the VCAG as the foundations for both design and development. It's worth mentioning that working on digital accessibility is an ongoing process as the product continuously evolves with new features. So you have to be aware all the time and include the accessibility in your process.
Adrian, what about your experience?
Maybe as a starting point, since we already mentioned WCAG quite a few times, that's an abbreviation for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and that's a set of guidelines that's coming from the World Wide Web Consortium, basically from the makers of the World Wide Web, if you will. So this is kind of the most recognized pillar of accessibility on the web and also for mobile apps. Just to mention that, to not confuse anybody. And yeah, I think that also for us, this was, I'm now working in the retail banking area, mobile and web application. For us, those WCAG guidelines, they were like the starting points. So we have been choosing some development frameworks that have been that are having a good reputation regarding WCAG support. We started to create our application based on that, and also had the requirement already like written on the wall that we want to do a good accessible app. But that was only the first step, because I think it really got going at the moment when we did our first analysis. And this analysis was done on the code side. On one side, we just looked at the code and checked everything that we've done on top of those framework. And we also invited some testers. There is a great organization here in Switzerland, Access for All. They provide people with disability as testers for your applications. And this was really like an eye-opener. So we went through the application with them. We witnessed how they are using the application with the screen reader, with voiceover, and all the pitfalls that they had. And yeah, based on that analysis and that experience, we created a battle plan. Kind of what do we need to change? How fast do we need to change it? I mean, there are like always those low-hanging fruits that you want to go first, because they're also the less effort ones. But yeah, that's where we are now. So we have implemented our first changes based on that battle plan, and more to come.
Right. So did you create the perfectly accessible app already?
No.
Does this exist?
No, that doesn't exist.
Yeah?
That doesn't exist.
Why? Tell me more.
But it's a really good question. I mean, there is no like limit where you can say, okay, now we have reached the perfectly accessible app. And my first question would be, accessible for whom? I mean, we have seen like at the beginning we have been talking about like temporary and all those different kinds of disabilities that we have, and we have like a huge spectrum. So like we cannot please everybody the same way. That's simply not possible. It's always like a compromise that you have to find. I mean, you have limited resources. That's a fact of life. So you have to spend your money wise. So you have to see, okay, where do we aim? What kind of disabilities do we want to remedy? I mean, not in the sense that we will heal the blind, but remedy in the sense that we provide a good accessible app, and where do we make compromises? And that's the sad reality. But you cannot do everything. I mean, that's simply impossible. But I think you should be broad. You should make sure that you have an okay experience for a broad majority of disabilities, and maybe you have a little bit more knowledge about your target group, then you can also maybe try to excel for certain disabilities.
Thank you. This was a nice answer to my maybe provocative question. And still another question in direction of, okay, maybe some of our audience are already heard accessibility. It's important, but they don't have yet motivation why should we do that? So why should digital services work on accessibility? Alex, do you have something for me?
Yeah, I like to share this example. Actually, very often there are many reasons to prioritize accessibility, but one notable example is the curb cut effect, which demonstrates how designing for people with, let's say, permanent disabilities can actually benefit everyone. This concept originated in the 1940s, I think, when a city in Michigan modified its streets by cutting the curbs to accommodate wheelchair users, making it easier to move between the sidewalk and the road. Surprisingly, this change didn't just help wheelchair users, it also benefited a wide range of people, such as parents with strollers, cyclists, skaters, and many more. Today, curb cuts are so common that we no longer view them as a special accessibility feature. They have simply become a standard part of everyday life. And another important information is, for instance, the World Health Organization estimates that over 1 billion people globally have some form of disability, representing roughly 15% of the population, which means that neglecting accessibility when designing digital products could exclude significant portion of users.
I maybe have a good example of, or it's a good follow-up to the curb cut effect that you mentioned, because there is also something like a reverse curb cut effect. Let me quickly explain. So in our project, we have a white label application that's for mobile and web banking, as I mentioned. And white label means basically all the banks can configure it, they can style it, but they can also have it in multiple languages, and they can translate it themselves, and they can add custom fonts. And we realized that when banks start to add their custom fonts, text might get longer. And if they add their custom translations or even languages that use a lot of characters, text might get even more longer. And so we started to change the application in a way that it suits longer text, so that there's some dynamics, that we have maybe a second line of text, that boxes with text start to grow, and all that kind of changes in the layout are happening. And we realized by doing that we are actually also improving accessibility now. Because in most phone operating systems, you can enlarge the font size if you are maybe somewhat older, or you don't have that good of a vision anymore. So you can increase the font size quite drastically. And now our app starts to respond to those changes in a much more meaningful way. And so it was basically, accessibility in this case was a byproduct of improving the application for different languages and different typography. So this was kind of also interesting to see that it can even happen kind of by the way. But yeah, in a more broad sense, I mean, why should we do it? I think from my perspective, there are three major reasons. So often it starts with a business having the fear of being sued. So there is some legislation in your country that says accessibility is important. So you just do it because the lawyers tell you to do it. And that's maybe the first stage of, it's not maybe that because you're convinced, but because you're in fear of the lawyers. And then maybe you start to realize, and that's the second stage, that there are customers and the market out there is actually demanding it. So like that maybe in my case now the banks want it, or maybe there is even like, as it was mentioned before, the buying power of the crowd of disabled users that you want to appeal to, and there is some money to make. So now it starts also to be interesting on the business side. And I think that's already better than the fear of being sued. But I think that the third level is kind of the level where we want to go. And the third level is just because we want it. Period. I mean, it's because we think it's a good thing for society, for everybody to have accessible applications, and we want to do it regardless of the monetary or the legal aspects behind it.
Yes, that's a very nice statement. I would also totally agree with you. Like, it is very beneficial to work on accessibility, not on people who have this, for the people who have disabilities, but actually for everyone who uses these services. But I would like to go now into another direction. You mentioned legislation, right? Like, it could be that you, our dear listeners, are listening to this podcast because you already heard that the European Accessibility Act is approaching, and next year there is a deadline that banking services, financial services need to follow the criteria of European Accessibility Act. Alex, can you give us just a short summary of like what is European Accessibility Act?
I'm not a legal expert, but I can say a few words about the European Accessibility Act. So the EAA, or European Accessibility Act, is a significant piece of legislation adopted by the European Union to promote accessibility for persons with disabilities. It aims to ensure that products and services within the EU market are accessible to all individuals, regardless of their physical or, for example, cognitive abilities. Key objectives of the European Accessibility Act include harmonizing accessibility requirements across the EU member states to create more consistent and accessible market for goods and services, promoting equal participation and inclusion by eliminating barriers to access for persons with disabilities, ensuring that consumers with disabilities have access to a wide range of products and services and are not unfairly disadvantaged due to accessibility barriers, and providing a legal framework for accessibility requirements and enforcement mechanisms within the EU. As you mentioned, European Accessibility Act will become effective in June next year and will cover banking services, e-commerce products, websites, mobile services, electronic tickets, and all sources of information for air, bus, and rail transport services, e-books, TV and video streaming, and phone services.
As I hear, this is a legislation by the European Union. So, Adrian, you're based in Switzerland. What about Switzerland? Is Switzerland affected?
Yeah, we have, traditionally, etc. is operating from Switzerland, and we have a large customer base in Switzerland too. And there is not like a direct equivalent of the European Accessibility Act here. But honestly, I would just advise every Swiss customer of etc. just to pretend as if it was here. And the reason why I say that is because, often Switzerland is taking over EU law and regulation in some way or form, especially in that area. So I think it's just a matter of time until that happens, so that we also will have a more strict accessibility regulations here that probably are pretty similar to what the European Union is doing. And also, Switzerland is a small country, and a lot of our clients and banks, they operate cross-border. And as soon as you have a user base in the EU, then you're already affected. So, I mean, that's another good reason. Just think about, do you really just have Swiss citizens as your customers? Can you really afford not to follow the regulation? And maybe also, if that's not convincing you, the third argument that I have for you is it's always more expensive to do it after the fact. I mean, so if you now like develop a new web-based service, a new software, a new whatever, it's much simpler to already think about accessibility, add it as a requirement. Changing an existing piece of software is much harder to adapt and much more costly. So start now and pretend as if it's already here.
Start now advice. And don't do it for legislation. Do it for the people. Do it for the sake of all your users, because this way you improve the quality of your services. So we know technology is evolving with like rapid steps, and there are more and more new technologies appearing out there. How can the new technologies support accessibility, or do they already do that?
I mean, there are a lot of interesting technologies out there. Like, I mean, artificial intelligence is now the new thing that we throw at everything, and we also throw artificial intelligence on the accessibility problem, so to speak. But in the end of the day, I think that the technology helps us to make it happen. But just like relying on it in a way that like it will just automatically happen when we have some AI doing some accessibility things, that's not going to work. So, I mean, we have to use those technologies in a clever way. We have to integrate them. But still, they're not just like doing it automatically. They're not doing the work for us. So they just help us to get there. And there's still a lot of blood, sweat, and tears involved when you want to make your app accessible, even with all those cool new technologies that we have.
I was hoping that the technology can help us, but there is no way.
I mean, I'm now also predicting the future, but I don't think that there will be like this magic bullet that solves all our accessibility issues, and we don't have to like do anything anymore and can just relax back in our comfy chairs. That's probably not going to happen.
Right. And wrapping this conversation up, I am enjoying it very much. And I hear that you can say so much. Like I'm really enjoying, like there is bubbling of knowledge coming out. And but still, so we as designers, so right now this podcast, there is me, there is Alex, and there is you, Adrian, in role of user experience designers talking about accessibility. How can we make sure, maybe there are some designers in our audience, so how can we make sure, people who talk to the designers, how can we make sure that we can improve our services with like, now just like if you can say three things that people can take with us, what will these be?
I think we already mentioned the key points. I would again say that conducting user research and usability testing, it's crucial part. Incorporating assistive technologies, of course, and gather continuous feedback from diverse groups of users.
Yeah, I would maybe just add here, you have to get going, you have to get off the ground. And I mean, if you do one thing, then it's maybe just granny testing or something like that. So you drag your grandmother into the testing lab, give her the app, and see what happens. And I think that should already be an eye opener, and that's pretty low barrier, low cost to do that. And you will already see like where your pain points are, and you can continue from there.
I like that, Adrian. Right. So, our dear listeners, invite your grandmother to accessibility test, and you will see that there is some nice work to be done, which will not improve only the life of your grandmother, but also of you and all the people around you.
Exactly.
Adrian, Alexander, thank you so much. This was very valuable for me, and I'm sure that we might have some questions. So thank you also, Ivana, for hosting us. And maybe I give over to you.
Well, thank you all for this insightful conversation, especially for me. And of course, for joining NetCetera's Tech Tribe. Thank you, Vesela, for taking the hot seat today and steering the conversation on this topic you are all so passionate about. Well, few words from me. Whether from mindful UX practices, creative data interpretation, or simply focusing on the user's needs, there is always room to make things better and more accessible to everyone. Remember to subscribe for more insights and discussions in our future episodes. I'm Ivana Paskoska. Until next time, stay curious and keep building a better digital world.